Okay, welcome back to Second Nature. Our esteemed guest here today, Peter Abraham. Peter, welcome to the show, buddy.
Hey guys, thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
You and I have been talking about doing this for a couple of months, it seems like. You claim to be a podcast listener here on Second Nature, and
So
you're
we've got a quiz for you.
yes, right.
Okay.
10 questions you'll need to answer before we continue.
All right. I'm
No,
already a fan. You don't have to worry about that.
yeah. Well, Peter, you're one of my favorite guys to catch up with intermittently, just to talk about the business side of the run space, especially. You've educated me a lot about what's happening in the cycling space, which is sort of Aaron's native domain also. So I'm sure you guys will connect on two-wheeled adventures during this conversation. But maybe just to kick things off, introduce yourself to the Second Nature audience, just a 60, 90-second introduction to who you are, what you do, your history in the industry.
Thanks, Dylan. Yeah, so my name's Peter Abraham. I have a long history of, I would say, in general, working in marketing, from producing television commercials to being the chief marketing officer of the LA Marathon, to being a brand consultant over the last 6, 7 years. So I've worked a lot with like Lululemon, with Nike, with Canyon Bikes, with Specialized, all kinds of different brands like that. I work the full kind of range of the marketing spectrum, from customer research and strategy all the way through content creation. I'm also very much an entrepreneur in terms of my mindset, my own point of view. So I'm part of a startup in London that is making 3D printed bicycle frames, and I'm also part of a real estate startup putting together short-term rentals, like buying houses for Airbnb and making them appeal to people like us, like outdoor sports and cycling people. Um, and I'm also currently, I love, my own personal mission is to affect positive change with my work. So I do a lot of nonprofit work. I'm on the board of directors of Hoka NAZ Elite, one of the largest professional running teams. I've been there since the beginning, and I mentor a lot of young professional athletes. And Dylan, that journey started more than 10 years ago with someone, Devin Yanko was the first athlete where I went, wow, I like helping young professional athletes. And
Cool.
so that's an important part of my world, I would say, is mentoring.
So fun. So there's a million different places we could jump off, but maybe start with this Airbnb thing, because one of the topics that I know you're passionate about, that we were texting about prior to our recording, was the global emergence of cultural sporting epicenters. So maybe
Yes.
before we get to that, this feels like an elegant lead in to what you're working on in the real estate department and how you make short-term rentals attractive to outdoorsy endurance sport athletes.
Sure. So, as an outdoor sports person, I have traveled all over in Europe and all around the United States, staying in Airbnbs if I'm going to a gravel race or going to Chamonix, etc. And what I have found is that they are consistently okay. They're sort of mediocre, lowest common denominator, very generic. And I feel like I'm going to Bentonville, Arkansas, one of the bike capitals. Dylan, you and I have talked about on Sunday. I'm staying in 2 different Airbnbs next week, and I can just tell already from the photos, they're like, okay, they're not great. And I just felt like, what if you could build an Airbnb out in a place like that, in a place like Chamonix, that really, or Flagstaff, Arizona, for runners, that really spoke to that person, with the artwork, with the, you check in, there's a gift card for coffee, like all the things that like somebody like us would want there. And so my brother feels the same way. He's a mountain biker. He's coming with me, and we're looking to buy our first property in Bentonville by the end of the year. And then we'll start, like, I know how to market things to outdoors people. So I'll start by like creating websites and, doing the marketing and good photography and all that. And making a great user experience, importantly. And we'll see how it goes, and then hopefully grow the business.
Peter, are you looking for investors in this new property down in
You
Bentonville,
know,
Arkansas?
it's funny you should ask, Dylan. I we had happened upon this in like 21, 22, and then in 22 the market started going crazy. We backed out of it, and I was down in Bentonville 2 months ago for work, and I called my brother. I'm like, we should dust off that business plan. It's still exploding here. And I just put together a deck so I could organize my own thinking. And I just mentioned that in passing to some friends of mine who I didn't even know were investors. They're like, we want to invest. So the answer is yes. I already have people calling me wanting to get in on this. So, of course, we're open.
I find it funny with Bentonville because I know a lot of cyclists who have been there a lot of times and ended
Yes.
up buying a property and then Airbnb-ing it out. And I kind of wonder how much of the population of Bentonville either is just transient because they own an Airbnb, and how much of the population there lives there, but then just bounces during like big event weekends in Bentonville to Airbnb their house out. It seems like almost every building in that city is available for Airbnb.
Yes, there are a lot of them, and there's no limit, on the number of Airbnbs that can be there. So there are a lot, and even there is some negativity in certain neighborhoods where people feel like, "Hey, I live here, and half the street is transient, and just comes in and out to an Airbnb." I totally understand that, but I do think a better experience can be created there, and that's what I'm going to try and do.
I've been in this process of working on a deck, sort of related, but really more about the travel side of it and travel tourism, sports tourism, and stuff. And the numbers that are out there for the economic impact of people traveling into a place like Bentonville. For example, the Bentonville Crew says that bicycling generates $137 million a year in economic benefits to the Northwest Arkansas region. And there's all kinds of other stats, like North Carolina's Department of Transportation says that 12% of the people coming into the area are staying even longer specifically for cycling. There's all kinds of extra stats in here, but the impact in a place like that is pretty substantial. And I think it's kind of an interesting question to ask of how do you work with the local groups there to really connect the dots on that stuff. Like, you're coming in to offer up space and to make it better for people that want to come in and cycle or do other endurance sports. But how do you work together with the locals too?
Yeah, you're making a good point. I mean, first of all, I would say like the outdoor recreation economy is underrated, I think, by a lot of people. People don't understand how big that is. And number two, I will say in full disclosure, last year I did a project with one runway group in Bentonville, which is owned by Stuart and Tom Walton, who built a lot of the infrastructure. And I helped in the idea of should there be a Silicon Valley for bikes that is a lot of brands in close proximity, like their offices, and should that be in Bentonville? And what would that take? And we had a bunch of, I don't know, CEOs in there from the bike industry and just roundtable discussions, like talking about how we could encourage that. And that is already starting to happen there. There's some super interesting things. Specialized has a kind of a experience center. YT Bikes has a really big experience center there. Allied is there. There are already a bunch of brands moving in there.
Rafa?
Rafa, yeah, they have an office there. And I do think, having now studied this a lot and spent a lot of time in Bentonville over the last 5 years, there's great benefit to an area like whether it's Wall Street or Hollywood or Silicon Valley, where people are in close proximity. You get kind of chance meetings and random collisions with people. It's way easier to meet up with people. And like in a place like LA, you have actors, you have executives, you have all these different, the craftspeople and cameramen. In a place like Arkansas, what I'm starting to see is like professional athletes, brands, governing bodies, like nonprofits, like all of this mixed up. And the chance meetings, like, oh, you're a professional athlete, we're looking to sign somebody, you might be perfect for us. Like, that just can't happen unless a bunch of people are in one place. So I do believe there's great benefit to that. And particularly coming out of the pandemic, I just think there's so much value now in like being in close proximity to each other.
It's interesting about Bentonville because prior to the Walton family investing a ton of money in it, no one was riding mountain bikes there. Whereas some of the other global hotspots like Chamonix, Flagstaff, you name it, people were already putting on giant races there and doing events. And so I've got to ask the question, if the Walton family ever decides not to invest in mountain biking, do you think Bentonville still stands a chance of actually being a mountain bikes mecca, or do you think that goes away?
It does.
Explain some of that history too, Peter, just to set the
Great.
foundation.
So Tom and Stuart Walton are grandsons of the founder of Walmart, Sam Walton. Okay, they're bike freaks. One went to Colorado, one went to Northern Arizona. They're really into outdoor sports. They're really passionate about bikes, and I think they're in their early 40s now. They have an investment vehicle called the Runway Group, where they have real estate investments, brands like Rafa. They're part owners of Wahoo, Allied Bikes, etc. And they have hospitality investments. and they do a massive amount of sort of nonprofit, foundation infrastructure work. And I think it's been incredibly successful. This is going back maybe 15 years, late 2000s. They started like just randomly, hey, let's help build a trail over there. And sort of grew, oh, why don't we help with that one? Oh, why don't we do that? And like all of a sudden, and now they have a guy who's amazing, Gary Vernon, supervising all the trail building. They've done over 500 miles of beautiful mountain bike trails. And so like when I say mountain bike trail, you think of like just a little trail through the woods. A lot of them are incredibly well crafted and creative and sculpted with like beautiful corners and like art installations. There's a big kind of art kind of component in the family, the Walton family. Like Alice built um, their their aunt built the Crystal Springs Art Museum, which is incredible in Bentonville. So there's a lot of art and creativity in the trails. And I would say if they just totally stop now, there's so much already in progress and so many miles of trail already built, it would keep going. And what is interesting about Bentonville is bikes have provided a culture. So in my kind of experience and observation, for a town like that or a region to sort of blow up, you need three things. Okay, you need jobs, you need a university, and you need culture of some kind. So look at Austin, Texas, like tons of jobs there. You had Dell Computer in the 90s, University of Texas, and then you had like a music culture, right? Which like South by has kind of attached itself to. Or if you look at Boulder, Colorado, like obviously a lot of jobs in Denver, University of Colorado, and then the whole mountain sports, outdoor sports culture there. And Northwest Arkansas, now you've got University of Arkansas in Fayetteville. You have just in Bentonville, you have the Walmart global headquarters. It's massive. They've almost finished their new campus. JB Hunt Transportation, which is massive, and Tyson Foods. And now you have bikes as a culture in the way you had music in Austin. So like if you're a 25-year-old, software engineer who's thinking about coming to work at Walmart, well, now you'd go, well, I love riding my bike. So yeah, I'll live there. And so it's really transformed the region. And I personally think there's like 15 or 20 years more growth there. And there are things that are not secret, but they're public. They're maybe not talked about so much now. Like there's a giant mountain bike park 2 hours south of Bentonville in a place called Mina that has a 1,400 vertical foot mountain there, and that's going to start construction I think early next year. And there's some other there's maybe a bicycle road course going in, a permanent road course. The property's already been purchased just north of town, so there's still years and years of development of infrastructure, and I think it proves to me that you got to start with the infrastructure, right? Whether it's trails or mountains or ocean in a surf spot, and then once you have the infrastructure, then you can layer in the other things.
So interesting to hear you talk about the mashing up of industry, culture, and sport. And Bentonville, I have never been, but I've been fascinated about it. You mentioned the runway group. I'm actually catching up with Matt Tarver next week,
Oh,
who
that's
runs
great.
that
Yes.
organization. And they're also interested to figure out ways in which they can take these purpose built trails for mountain biking and attract people like me who are more trail running
Yes.
oriented.
Yes.
But I wondered, we don't need to spend the entire episode on Bentonville, but having never been there myself, I would love to hear you just describe the vibe there and how you feel that investment in that type of recreational infrastructure has impacted the local economy and even like the mind state and health state of the local population.
Those are great questions. I mean, I first started going to Bentonville like 5 years ago, late 2019, I think. And when you first go there, you're flying in on the plane. You're like, come on, this is we're going to the Ozarks. Like this is going to be like a happening sports place. You just can't believe it. So I think when you first arrive the first time, your expectations are set very low, and it under promises and over delivers. Okay, that's the first sort of like your first impression. The town itself of Bentonville, the center of town is where Walmart #1 was. It's a museum called the Five and Dime, but it's on the little cute town square. It's a very small town. Now there are sort of like suburbs and it goes out a few miles, but it's surprisingly small. But the mountain bike trails like start like a block from the town square, like right there, like a super technical downhill, amazing. And they go in all directions for miles and miles. And like I personally have 8 or 10 friends who have moved there for bike culture, like just myself. And there's the Meteor Cafe, which is bike shop and totally themed around bikes. There's Onyx, which is kind of a bike headquarter. There's the Rafa store. There's bike shops. There's Airship Coffee. I mean, there's a whole kind of sports culture. There's one of the Airship coffees is in the mountain bike zone. Like it's like a mile from the nearest road. Like you either have to walk or ride there to get to this beautiful fancy coffee shop that's like looks like Tadao Ando Japanese architecture, like super modern. And so I do feel like it has had a tremendous kind of upside benefit to the local economy. I have not measured it. I have not looked at the data, but just observing just in the last 5 years, I can see how much the town has grown based on bike culture.
I've
One
just pulled up Google Maps. Sorry, Lucy. I just wanted to say, if you pull it up on Google Maps, I mean, you can see, and this is something I talked to Matt Tarver about too, who runs the Runway Group,
Yeah.
about how little outdoor recreation opportunity there is in the surrounding areas. And I think they benefit from the fact that, within a few hundred miles around them is Kansas City, St. Louis, Memphis, Tennessee, even like Dallas, Fort Worth, Oklahoma City. So they can sort of absorb all that interest and all that economic purchasing power of the surrounding areas who don't have available access to this type of terrain.
That's right. And the Ozarks in that area, I'm going to do a gravel race there in a week.
The Big
It's
Sugar?
I'm doing Big Sugar. I'm riding in it, and it's surprisingly great and rural and remote. And there are lakes and there are rivers and river rafting and kayaking, and like you get out there in the Ozarks, like up in Missouri, man, you are out there. Like you're really out there, and it's there it's actually way more beautiful than I thought, and it's a great place.
Branson, Missouri is only 90 minutes down the road too, and they actually have an awesome bike park called Howler Bike Park.
Yeah.
Conveniently, as we're recording this podcast, I just released 2 videos on my YouTube channel, one at Howler Bike Park and one in Bentonville. So this is actually kind of perfect timing. But one of the things that really struck me on my time in Bentonville, and I've been there a handful of times for Bike Fest, which is like the big mountain
Yes.
bike festival that they have run by Red Bull athlete Kenny Belay.
Yeah.
But one of the things that really stands out to me about Bentonville specifically is not just how much stuff there is for people that know what they're doing on a bicycle, but how much stuff there is to take people from zero to hero. And that for me, when I was driving through Bentonville with my son, he really had only spent a couple days on the bike, and there was so much for him to do where he could build confidence and build some level of skill on the bike by lots and lots of repetition. There's a place called Slaughter Pen that has a
Yes.
bunch of pump tracks and small drops that build up to bigger
Amazing.
drops that build
I
up to
know that
bigger
spot.
drops.
Yes.
And I think what's even more important is Bentonville as a place, as a training ground to take people who have never ridden mountain bikes, because there are all kinds of global epicenters that the number one practitioners, the pros, the elites are going to want to go to ride. But for there to actually be a purpose-built place where you could take someone who's never ridden a mountain bike or never run on the trail and give them maybe one of the best, easiest entry point experiences you could imagine, that's something special. And I think one thing that I've noticed on the handful of times that I've been to Bentonville too is that you see a lot of the locals riding, and you have to wonder, did these people have mountain bikes 3 or 4 years ago? Maybe not, but the fact that there is accessible riding, it's not all way over your head. There's
Yeah.
so much basic stuff there that can help people even get started in the process.
Yeah, Aaron, you're making some super good points. So, number one, on the idea of progression, you can start here and go up to here. I've taken a 12-year-old kid out mountain biking to that Slaughter Pen area you're talking about. Like, here, start on the 1 foot jump. Okay, try the 2 foot. Okay, try the 5 foot. Like, you can build up. And so, it's really built for developing and learning. And you're right, most places are not. Like, if you go to, just for example, Yosemite, like the climbing there really starts at like 5'9", 5'10". Like, there's no like learning how to climb there. And I think in terms of like how the locals see it, I know talking to Gary, some of the things they've done were like there's a main road where a lot of families drive their kids to and from school, and along that road is like a pump track for mountain bikes, like right there 5 feet away, so the kids could see people riding when they're going to school and go, hey, I want to do that. So they've been very strategic about all this. None of this has happened by accident. And so you're making good points, Aaron.
So, moving off of Bentonville specifically, build off this with your macro theme of global sport tourism epicenters. You've mentioned Chamonix, you've mentioned Flagstaff, Arizona, Boulder. What's on your mind here, Peter?
Well, because I'm a outdoor sports freak and I have go to these places, and in high school, skiing was like the religion in our family. My parents were divorced, so my dad and my brother and I moved to Chamonix and went into the local school there. My brother and I, and that you can imagine, that was like 1980. All my friends' parents were famous mountain guides. We skied like 5 days a week. It was like really a life-changing experience for me. And that when you go to Chamonix now and you go, wow, just the sports culture that was still there, that was there back then. It's just grown now with like trail running and other things. And I just traveled around and I see these places that attract a lot of people in a certain sport. Flagstaff being one. I go there with the NAZ elite team I'm part of all the time. So I see like that is no question the distance running capital of North America. Like I would say half the distance runners in North America live there. The other half go there for like 3 week altitude blocks. And then, you have in Spain now, you have Girona, Spain, which has really become like the European cycling equivalent, kind of like Bentonville, but the Spanish version in its own way. And so I think all of these places, and I think it's more than just, oh yeah, there's a lot of good, terrain or infrastructure there. That's part of it, and that's what starts attracting the people. But then it becomes a community, and so the community part is really important, particularly for like 20 somethings. Like I know a lot of young pro cyclists who live in Girona, and the reason they could live anywhere in Europe, but the reason they go there is because there are a bunch of other 25-year-olds who also live there and are also training, that they can plug into that community and have friends. And certainly the same is true in Flagstaff and Chamonix and Bentonville. So it's part infrastructure in the place, but once those places start growing, everybody comes there because of the community.
You know
So,
what's in Go
go
ahead.
ahead, Aaron.
What's interesting to think about, we've been talking about this idea of having these epicenters and then the jobs that come with it and the reason why these 20 somethings go there. And your background in business and helping athletes and creating content and stuff like that, you wonder also, like, what is the opportunity from a business standpoint, not just to have these Airbnbs, but what if you had a content agency to help the athletes where they could plug into these filmers, editors, whatever, to really put your foot on the gas in each one of these places.
Yeah, it's a
Now we're
great
talking.
idea. And there's definitely like a phase two and a phase three of this direction that could
uh,
like start leveling up to all kinds of interesting things like content. So yes, smart idea. Agreed.
That's so funny. We Aaron and I stepped all over each other to ask the same exact question. That's basically where I was going to go. Is like, what's the opportunity there? Then, I mean, obviously, there's a abundance of opportunity to recreate outdoors. Is it like you think about brands all the time, Peter, and strategy of how brands can connect authentically with a consuming audience as it pertains especially to sport? When it comes to the emerging global sports and culture epicenters, as you call them, how would you advise brands to take advantage of that momentum?
I think they have to spend time there. Like I was just yesterday riding bikes with my friend Zip Allen, the chief business officer at Strava. And I was like, Zip, I know you guys go to Bentonville. You got to have somebody there next week between Little Sugar and Big Sugar. It's kind of like Bike Week in the United States. You got to have some people there. And so, number one, I think you have to have some kind of presence there. And like what I see in Bentonville is more and more businesses moving there and setting up, because, wow, there are athletes, there are influencers, there are other brands, there are nonprofits that come here. Like they become like kind of an epicenter for a particular activity or a pursuit. And you could see with Chamonix, I don't know, like I think Solomon is maybe nearby in Annecy, right? And
Yep.
you could see more and more mountain focused brands putting offices near there. Same with Girona, like Girona, Spain. I've never seen more fancy bike shops in one town anywhere. I mean,
The
it's
service
fancy, like,
course.
yeah, boutiques, Roca Corba, Velodrome, all these places. And so, and I can see like brands opening offices there is going to be the next thing. And so, and one of the things I see with a lot of brands, with like the leadership teams, is they just they're too far removed from the customer. Like let's say the C-suite is in a lot of some brands, the C-suite is not going and doing marathons or bike races, and they're just too far distant from the core customer, and they have no idea who they're designing products for or creating content for. And I just think it's incredibly important for the C-suite to actually be out there doing the events. Like one guy that I see is really impressive is Ken Lausberg, the CEO of SRAM. Man, you see him in Steamboat, he's riding the gravel race. You see him at Sea Otter, standing there talking to customers for like 8 hours. Like, I'm like, that guy is in the community. And I totally respect that. And so I think that's really an important thing. And so these towns become a really great way, um, for brands to be in touch with all kinds of levels of the community. I'm in Flagstaff a lot. And I know Mike McManus, the sports marketing director of Hoka, is there all the time, and I
Yep.
see him there.
Yeah, such a good point. And I feel like it's a perfect jumping off point to start talking more about brands. And maybe this is an indication of why we've seen so much momentum with these challenger brands, because as you said, Peter, maybe in these larger organizations, the leadership team is too far away from the customer. Would you diagnose that as being maybe one of the reasons why these challenger brands are succeeding, because they are inherently closer to the customer and they understand the culture?
Yeah, that no question. Now, and the challenger brands don't have scale yet. No matter what, you're talking about running shoes, you could be talking about bikes, whatever it is, they don't have scale yet, so they're probably paying more to manufacture things, et cetera. So they do have some disadvantages. At the same time, it's just super important to be in touch with your customers. And I'm think the other problem I see is brands that get I'm like I've been working around for a long time, and I've worked for some brands that have been acquired by private equity, and I just want to say I think that is often a problematic arrangement. Private equity's objective usually is to increase net operating income and then flip the asset in like 3 to 5 years. That's kind of their investment horizon. It's not wrong, but that is what they're trying to do. So in things that inherently make the brand more interesting or more appealing to customers often get cut out because they're trying to increase income and trim things that don't pay off in 3 to 5 years. And kind of brand initiatives, first of all, you can't measure them on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month basis. Like, how much does Red Bull make from putting on all these events around the world? Like, who knows, right? It's not
I do. I
measurable.
know.
Aaron brought this up on the last episode that we
Yeah,
recorded, where he was saying, use Red Bull as an example of this infinite game mindset, where
right,
they invest in things not because there's going to be a direct return on that investment,
right.
but because it builds the brand, and over a long enough period of time that helps the consumer connect with the brand
Correct.
and the
And so
product.
that's like long-term thinking. And in these private equity backed brands, I just see it over and over. They just start cutting things and it's just not a good long-term play.
Shout out to our friend Dre, who actually just wrote an article about the difference between On Running and Red Bull in the dance space. He talked about how Red Bull was there to contribute to the movement of breakdancing BC1 has been around forever, and they're
Yeah,
contributing to the culture, whereas On Running brought in FKA Twigs to like show that they're in touch with dancing. It's not the same.
right.
And one of the things that was a big trend for a long time in CPG specifically, and actually my first job at Red Bull was this role called the field marketing manager. And that was sort
Yeah,
of just an amalgamation of all the different things that marketing could touch: culture marketing, sports marketing, collegiate athlete, event, you name it.
yeah,
But what the real, other than being kind of the operator for giant markets, the real job, in my opinion, was to be in touch with the opinion leaders of each market and then to
yes.
take that intelligence up to the next level up so that you could share what is happening on the ground. How should we adapt and take that information and do something with it?
Yeah, and obviously Red Bull has been so great at this. I spent the whole day Saturday with, one of the members of their team and one of their content creators, and like they have just gone so deep in content creation at such an organic level. I got to give them credit. And I've been thinking lately, like I came up in my career making television commercials, like in the 90s, early 2000s, when brand advertising was sort of the only kind of advertising, right? And now, I've spent maybe the last 15 years working more on the digital side. And I realize there's a whole kind of generation of marketers like 20 years plus younger than me who only know digital marketing and ROI and conversion percentage and email open rate and Facebook ads and paid Google search, right? And they're like, brand, what is brand? And I feel like there is a place for both, quite honestly. Like, you see what Red Bull is doing, and that brand work does make a brand so much more interesting and deep. And I feel like there are a lot of brands now that are only doing performance marketing, and I just feel like that it's just really boring to me to only do that. It's really boring.
One of our favorite hobby horses here. What are the consequences downstream of that, Peter? We've talked about in the past sort of the death of brand and the rise of products. In other words, you can scroll on Instagram and it's not necessarily like you're connecting with the story of a brand, but you see a cool shoe and you say, oh, I'll just buy that, not really knowing anything about the history or the values of said brand. Is that where we're headed right now? Are brands losing their power culturally?
They don't have to, but a lot of them are losing their power culturally. And I think, and I'll tell you a brand that like I've been very close to and worked with a lot for years, I think is doing a really good job with it, is Hoka. I mean, if you think back, like in 15 years, they've gone from zero to like, I think they're over $2 billion run rate right now.
One of the
And
great sport, or one of those great sport business stories that
no
needs to be
question.
told, needs to
And,
go on How I Built This.
right. And I've been like up very close to it for, most of that time, the last 10 years, certainly. And I've really watched. And for me, there's like three things happening that they're doing in their formula. Okay. And I remember like 2011, 2012, right when I was leaving the LA Marathon, I remember walking through a running store and there's like, I don't know, 100 pair of shoes on the wall, right? And they all looked almost identical. And I remember saying to myself, the world just does not need another running shoe brand right now. Well, of course, I was totally wrong because Hoka comes in. First of all, it looks different and it feels different. Okay. So they have a unique product, which is interesting. Okay. Then number two, their kind of, I would say, brand point of view all the way along has been certainly about diversity and inclusion. Like, hey, anybody can wear our shoe. You can be old, you can be young, you could be any ethnicity, you could be any sexual orientation. Great, you're welcome in our tent. At the same time, they've also been very into traditional sports marketing. Like Mike McManus came over from Adidas. They've got, Jim Walmsley. They have triathletes. They have we had an athlete from NAZ, Adrian Wildscott over at the Olympics in the 10,000. Like they've got, great athletes on the track, in marathon, triathlon, etc. So they do have like traditional sports marketing, like that's, I would say, a traditional brand play. They have inclusion. They're pretty up to speed on digital, and then they have a unique brand. So I really got to give them props for doing a great job. And there have been different leaders along the way. They're on their third or
Yeah,
fourth leader, so it's not like one person was just responsible for Hoka's growth.
right. It's not founder mode, so to speak.
Correct. There we go. Thank you.
It
Yes.
has translated over now at least a few different leadership teams, and
Yeah.
the momentum seems to only be accelerating. You
Yes.
also prompted us to discuss, speaking of Hoka, you've mentioned your work that you've done with the Hoka NAZ elite team,
Yeah.
and you mentioned that your work there recently kind of led you to come up with a new framework to think about coaching and leadership and how those things are evolving here in 2024.
Yeah, last year, maybe summer, fall, we had to hire a new coach, a head coach for the team. Ben Rosario had moved up from being the coach to being the sort of executive director and running everything. He's been great. He's been like my partner there for 10 years. And so we started interviewing coaches, and it was Ben and I and Mike McManus from Hoka. We did Zoom interviews with coaches from all over the country, really top running coaches. And we ended up hiring Jack Mullaney from University of Portland, who was not like, sort of a famous guy, like a former Olympian or something. I think he had not even run in college. What I realized though in the interview process, he over indexed in communication skills and EQ. He was an incredible communicator. And as we're going through the interview process, I'm watching like what's going on like in NFL and NCAA football and like Bob Belichick, wow, he's not winning games anymore. Oh, he's fired. And like those kind of old school, it's my way or the highway coaches are kind
Mm.
of like that ain't happening anymore. And I would say it's a leadership thing and it's a generational thing. Like 25-year-olds right now don't want to work for like a CEO who's in that mode, and they don't want to play sports for a head coach like that. And so I started, this was sort of my working philosophy, like starting last fall into the winter. And so I started, when I would run into some world-class coaches, I would validate the concept with them. So I had dinner randomly at a friend's house in December with Magnus Backstedt, who is the head coach of Canyon, or the director sportif of Canyon SRAM cycling team. They won the women's Tour de France with Kasia Adoma. And Magnus has two daughters who are pro cyclists. And I was like, Magnus, I want to run this idea by you. Is coaching changing this way? And he was like, absolutely, 100%. Let me explain it to you. And then this spring, I went to a big track meet at UCLA where NAZ was running, and a bunch of other great athletes. And I ran into Diljit Dosanjh Taylor, the kind of legendary head coach of BYU, NCAA champion. She herself is kind of a force of nature. And I was like, Diljit, what are your thoughts on how coaching is evolving right now? She's like, the X's and O's of coaching are available to anyone. The kind of like, let's say, intervals or altitude training or that kind of stuff. Anybody could find out about that on the internet if they did enough searching. She said it's all about building relationships now and communication skills. She said you can still be hard on an athlete if you need to be, but you got to do it in the right way. And so I figured if Diljit and Magnus are on board with the same idea, it's probably true.
Aaron, does that give us hope that AI is not coming for the coaching jobs too? We were just talking about how whether content creation is going to exist in the same way in 5 years when ChatGPT can spit out podcasts as good or better than Aaron and I can produce them. This
There's
may
no
be,
way.
see, yeah, okay, so we're
Well,
safe. So as long as we have EQ, coaching is safe and maybe podcasting is safe
Yeah,
too, right,
I
Peter?
think
it's
it is.
it's taste, right? Like it really comes down to taste because you can find the X's and O's anywhere, and AI is an efficiency tool more than anything else. But when it comes down to taste, I just think, and EQ is a big part of that as well, right? Like being able to
Correct.
deliver the right information, but in the right way.
Yes.
That's
And that human creativity, like the great art, for example, is not going to come from AI, in my opinion, ever. It's just not. There'll be like mediocre crap, but like the great stuff is not going to come that way. You just can't replace that, the some of the certain human elements.
Yeah, I mean that it strikes me though as a unique and somewhat novel insight that you're touching on, though, Peter. And I don't know if you came up with it originally, but I do think that it is inherently true that now going forward, information is so abundant that you aren't relying on traditional gatekeepers like the media, like coaches to help you learn how to train appropriately. So you're going to them for something different and maybe equally important in terms of high touch care for the path that you're on and maybe some more nuanced perspective on the X's and O's of the training in the coach's case, but it is more about the relationship rather than it is about the knowledge.
Yeah. And I think, I mentor all these young professional athletes. And what I see is like the kind of like intervals and stuff, like they don't necessarily, that's easy for them. They got that or
Yeah.
they have a coach. But the burning questions they have are like, okay, I've got this decision in front of me. I have to go with this team or this team. What do I do? How do I look at the next 3 months, and how should I focus my time as a 23-year-old who's trying to finish college and trying to be a professional athlete? Like, it's those kind of existential life questions that are they really need a lot of help with, less so the like, well, how many VO2 efforts should I do tomorrow, whatever.
Yeah.
This is exactly what
So
we were talking about on that last pod, where every answer is actually yes, and it's discerning which is the way to go in context, right?
Yes,
Like in,
yes.
in the scenarios of these athletes where they have multiple offers on deck, or where Dylan and I could pursue 50 different businesses right now. The
Yeah,
answer is like, yeah, that's also every choice you have is a good choice, but this is the one that might feel right in
right.
context.
And what I often do is I go, just let's hold on a sec. Let's pull up to 40,000 feet. Just set that decision aside. let's just look at the next 3 years. Where do you want to be in 3 years or 2 years or 5 years? Like, let's look at that. Okay, now let's zoom back in and make this decision in the context of you want to get there. Is this going to take you closer to there, or is this going to take you on a left turn somewhere you don't want to go? So let's like understand the context of what you're trying to decide. And I want to add here that when I mentor all these young athletes, it's a two-way thing. Like they're not just listening to me, I'm listening to them and I'm learning from young people. So I believe great mentoring goes both ways and it's an equal sort of a
Mm,
partnership or learning experience. I don't think it's like me just pontificating to young people. I'm also learning so much about their point of view, where they are in the world, and I'm really grateful for that.
that's beautiful. So mapping this to a business context too, I'd be curious to get your opinion, Peter. Like organizationally, are we seeing something similar? Like with leadership and EQ now being something that the executives have to over index on rather than the IQ element? Or like
I
even
think
with a
so.
consumer too, it feels like we could use the example of the Nike ad, winning isn't for everyone. That came off to a lot of people as overly aggressive and maybe lacking EQ, right? So maybe from a business perspective, as it pertains to organizational structure and how those organizations interface with the consumer, I'd love to get your perspective on that.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I've not been out with at every business in the world, but I mean, I know you guys have been talking on your podcast a lot about Nike lately and what is going on there, um, and how they brought in a new CEO. How is he different from the old one? I'm not sure. But if you look at, there are some businesses that are incredibly successful that do have leaders that have EQ. Like I would say, Brian Chesky at Airbnb is one,
Founder
and
mode.
founder mode. Yeah, but like also, he has emotional intelligence, and so I think that is really important. And I think you could go around kind of go around the business world and look at versions of this happening, and I think you would see a trend in this direction.
So, one of the things that Aaron is passionate about that you were early to the game on, Peter, was the power of content and storytelling to achieve commercial successes in the marketplace. Maybe sketch the arc of how that's evolved in the last 15 years, how brands are and content creators are leveraging modern distribution channels, YouTube, podcasts, newsletters, et cetera, in a way that wasn't available to you early in your career, and what kind of impact that's made. And then I'm sure Lucy will have a response.
Yeah. So, as I mentioned earlier, like I started producing television commercials. So I was an early content creator as a producer of like big budget, Ford, Little Caesars Pizza, Pepsi commercials, et cetera. I made a bunch of sports films also and a music film about Wilco. If you like Wilco, I made like the film about them. I'm Trying to Break Your Heart. And I was the financier and producer, directed by Sam Jones. And I think, um, of course, as you started to see in the early 2000s with social media coming on board, then YouTube, like you started to see the kind of influencer or content creator come up. And I remember like in 2011, I started working with what is now NAZ Elite, but a bunch of the Flagstaff marathoners, kind of advising them on their brand. And this was like before Instagram was a thing. And so like I was like, you guys should just be building your own brand. And you just do that on Twitter. Like just start a Twitter account, no big deal. Well, if you fast forward like, 10 years now, content creation, of course it's really important, and of course we see like Red Bull and some brands have really embraced it. um, um, I think like, look, I think of great content like, does it bring value in some way? Does it connect a community? Does it tell an inspiring story? Does it inform about product? Is it entertaining? Like there's high quality content. There's tons of like low quality, like really forgettable content out there now because everybody wants to kind of check a box. I don't see too many brands really committing to high quality content, bring in like really, really like great content creators. But what I've seen, like for athletes and particularly runners and outdoor athletes in particular, like it went from like, yeah, build your own brand, and now there are two things going on. Number one is there's so many channels for content. It's like overwhelming between YouTube and TikTok and Instagram and threads and like a blog and like it's just it's too much. Okay, number one. And number two, the demands on being a professional athlete now are like more than they've ever been. I don't care what sport you're in. There's nutrition, there's mental health, there's sleep, there's the training, there's core strength work, travel. Like it's all you can do in a day to just be a really good professional athlete. Forget trying to create content. So at NEZ, we've tried to like, hey, why don't we bring in some photographers and video creators and we'll help make the content so you guys don't have to like feel responsible for doing that. And I do see that a lot. I mean, there are very few like really high level athletes who are also doing their own content creation. Like there are very few now, like almost none, I would say. So it's really changed a lot.
I think brands would be smart to overinvest in athletes as a lever instead of just having their own. I've seen so many times over where brands are trying to create their own, and rightly so, are trying to create their own content. But when they find an athlete to get behind and they start investing in the athlete level content, it just seems to be a bit easier to grow in general because there's a bit more credibility kind of baked into an athlete directly as opposed to a brand trying to grow. And the athlete has so much more, breadth that they can tap into when it comes to telling stories and everything. Uh, when it comes
Yes.
to athletes as a lever beyond just your podium appearances, beyond your performances, it's still, even though there are lots and lots of channels on YouTube and everything else, it still feels relatively untapped, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I would add something that's like I have advised many brands on, hiring professional athletes from Lululemon to Canyon Bikes to all kinds of other brands. And one thing that I really, and particularly if it's a younger startup-y brand, one of the things I say first is like, wait, stop looking at athletes. Okay, just set those aside. Decide on what you stand for. Okay, who are you? And can you clearly articulate that? What is your mission? Okay, now let's go back and look at athletes and figure out who are the athletes who align with that mission. So imagine if you're, I'm going to say Patagonia, all about sustainability. Of course, there's a certain kind of athlete that would appeal to them and a certain that would not. And it's really important to be clear on that. And I see too many brands kind of like grasping at straws. Like, I don't know, there's an athlete with a big following without going like, wait, hold on, what does this all mean? What does it add up to? And who are you guys? And are you all aligned?
So interesting. One thing that I was going to mention here that you just brought to mind that is somewhat new, at least in my awareness, is brands giving athletes what they're calling a media budget now. So, in other words, a professional trail runner will be able to hire a photographer to shoot and document their race as a way to sort of connect with their following, usually on probably Instagram and TikTok more than any other platform, not necessarily YouTube or long form content. But to me, that feels like a recognition from a brand level of the importance of this and the power that those athletes have when those stories are captured and articulated live and on the platforms where the consumers are already present, those being the social platforms. So, anyway, just an anecdote I wanted to toss in here that I've seen happening more in professional trail running, in addition to a salary, a performance budget for use for body work, for example, obviously, like podium incentives. I'm seeing now more athletes getting a media budget so that they can hire photographers and tell their own stories.
That's a smart idea, and it does encourage those athletes to hire more high quality content creators than they might rather than just doing it with their own phone. And I mean, there's some athletes who've gotten very good at doing it with their own phone, like Hella Sidibe at
Oh,
Hoka. Like
yeah.
he's just like so endearing and charming, like God. But there are other athletes who definitely, I just go. Sometimes I'm just like crying inside, going, "Why can't you just get a good cameraman or storyteller to work with you?" And so it's a great point that you're bringing up, Dylan.
It does make a huge difference, though. So, just like as an example, Francois Den a couple of weeks ago won the Tour de France, this big 330-kilometer race in the Aosta Valley of Italy. And because of the length of the race, it took him 2.5 days or something like that. And he had a team of photographers that was updating his story and his main Instagram feed all the time. And it was just like a really fun and nice way to spectate the race as a fan of Francois personally. And in all likelihood, that budget comes from Solomon in order to make that a reality for Francois. And hopefully that then trickles down to more people rocking the Francois kit on their local trail running adventures. So winding down now, Peter, before we get to BPC, sort of the final topic that you prompted me on that I know is top of mind for you is that there's a cultural trend towards joy that you're
Yeah.
noticing. Say more about that.
Okay. So obviously, we're all, I guess, sort of emerging, I guess, from the pandemic. I know it's not technically over, but the lockdowns are mostly over and we're not mostly wearing masks anymore. And I just feel like the world is sort of remembering how to have fun again. And I could really see it in Paris. I was not there at the Olympics, but I talked to a lot of people who were, and I watched a lot of it on Peacock. And I could see the joy in the city among the fans. I could see the joy in the venues among fans. I could see the joy among athletes like Hunter Woodall and Tara Davis. Like that combo was just unbelievable. And I could just see, Nikki Hiltz and I could just see the joy among so many athletes. And I just felt like that was really beautiful. And I see it, with Kamala Harris and Tim Waltz. I see some of that energy. And I see it as kind of a cultural trend right now in the world that we're remembering how to have fun again, and joy is part of our lives. A lot of people had forgotten over the last few years because it was a very difficult few years. And so that's kind of how I'm seeing it.
How does that impact business? Is it good for business to be joyful?
I think it is good for business. It means you need to maybe reorient your marketing a little bit and sort of repackage things and how you're explaining them. A lot of things, particularly in running, like I'm going to say historically, has been kind of a tired, like it's hard model for marathoning. It's hard, they're sacrificing. And I just feel like that storytelling tone, that story is tired now. And it's just not too exciting for me, with running.
I love it. That's a point of optimism to close down the episode.
Yeah. Aaron, what do
Joy.
you think? Aaron, what do you think?
I'm all for it. I'm a genuinely happy person, yeah, I agree with you. Like, making stuff look hard is not necessarily a way to grow anything. Like, yeah, come do this. You're gonna just suffer the entire time. Like,
Yeah.
find a way to make it fun.
Yeah.
I've learned this lesson firsthand a lot
Yeah.
recently, and the more fun you make it look, you know, yeah.
And I would say there's a trend has been emerging among all kinds of sports over the last 5-6 years that is aligned with this. If you look at things like pickleball, which is all about fun and community, if you look at gravel racing, so much is about community and fun, and we're all out here together. I would say even a little bit of trail, which is less focused on like a time, like a marathon, and more like, hey, we're outdoors and enjoying it. Like, I think there are a lot of sports that are have been kind of following this trend for a few years, actually.
Yeah. It reminds me of something we've talked about recently. There was a cool article in the New Yorker about Rivendell, a cycling
Yeah.
company that's built around just the joy of riding the bikes, and
Yes.
everything else is frivolous. And I
Yes.
love just how clean and simple that mission is for
Yes.
a company. And I feel like there's a similar opportunity in running to just
Yeah.
lean into the simple joy of running, and probably a message that some brand will notice and try and
Yeah.
capture for
Yeah.
the consuming audience
Yeah.
in the near future. Moving on to our closing segment, brand product content. Peter, you are our guest here, so the floor is yours.
I would say what really has caught my eye in the last 2 weeks is the UCI World Gravel Championships that were last weekend, Saturday and Sunday in Belgium. And gravel racing, not as a surface, but gravel racing is a medium that was really invented in the United States, very much like mountain biking. Okay, but the Europeans I started doing gravel races in Europe a couple of years ago, and I could see that they were onto it, and they were catching up, and they were into it. And now you can see they're really getting into it. And there's some very big races there all over Europe. The Traca and Girona is one of the biggest gravel races in the world. They're in Australia. They're all over. And the UCI World Championships, um, you know, because it was in Belgium, they got tons of cyclocross stars. The stars of road cycling showed up. Matthew Van Der Poel won the men's race. Marianne Vos won the women's race. Those are like the biggest stars in cycling. They're global mega stars. And they had a beautiful live stream. Like none of the American races really have a competent live stream. And they had thousands and thousands of fans. I mean, Europe, obviously, it's cycling mad, Western Europe, Belgium, and, it's much denser. So, like at the finish, it looked like a Tour de France stage. I mean, there must have been 10,000 people just around the finish line. It's nuts. And I was like, my thought was like, is this another sport like mountain biking that the Europeans are co-opting and are actually going to do better than the Americans, even though the Americans invented it? And so that was and I posted about that on Threads over the weekend, and oh my God, I got hundreds of comments and angry people, and you don't know what you're talking about, and Americans didn't invent gravel, and like people were angry about it. But you hit a hot button when you start getting a lot of comments. So that's my BPC and sort of like piece of content was watching the European UCI World Gravel Championships on Sunday.
Love it. Lutzi, you want to go next?
Sure. I'm going to continue on with the joyful kind of brand vibe here. And also a shout out to someone who is in our Slack channel for Second Nature, which is absolutely exploding right now. And the people that are coming in there. And
Peter, we got to get you in there, buddy.
Get me on there. Send me an invite. Por favor.
Man. Hit the show notes. It's in everyone. Anyway, so I want to give a shout out to Elliot Matson. He's launched this brand called Folklord, which I think is just really kind of whimsical and fun, and exactly like all the photos on this website are just kind of like fun. It looks like he's having a really fun time out there running, and they've got some different gear like hats and shirts and stuff, and it really, when you were talking about joy and having fun outside, this really kind of speaks to that. There's not a picture on this website of someone suffering on a trail while they're running up a hill. It's all just like, he looks really stoked and it looks really fun. And it's just, I dig it. So plus extra points for being in the Slack channel, but also as a standalone, this brand looks really fun and cool. And I'm excited to keep an eye on another Portland local brand. So Folklord.
Folklord. Yeah, now, Elliot says it's not athleisure, it's liege-letic, I think is the branding that he uses.
Okay, you heard it here first. Thanks, Aaron.
Yeah. Totally different concept. Flip it on its head, like Charlie Munger said, just invert it and you got something special there. Okay, just two quick ones. I got my fresh new Mountain Gazette number 202 yesterday. We've talked about Mountain Gazette on the podcast a million times, including having Mike Rogie, the publisher, on. I also have my new Like the Wind magazine here. And also Simon Freeman, I talked to on the phone today. He's the publisher of Like the Wind. He's in the Second Nature Slack group too, and is an avid listener. So shout out to both those guys, and 100% must subscribe to both these publications. And then another piece of content that I'm halfway through right now is Jerry Lorenzo from Fear of God. Are you guys familiar with Fear of God, the brand?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Oh, Peter, come on, dude. Oh, you would love this guy, man. Oh my God. So Jerry Lorenzo is the son of Jerry Manuel, who played, I think, for the Atlanta Braves for a number of years, had a great professional career as a baseball player. Jerry Lorenzo, his son, played baseball growing up, and then he worked in the nightlife scene in LA for a while, eventually started working for Kanye West, just making all Kanye's merch. And then they had a separation. I'm not sure exactly what happened there, but he starts to talk about it in this podcast that I'm referencing here. Anyway, Jerry Lorenzo and Fear of God have always, captured my imagination of just like what a brand should be in terms of its aesthetic being consistent over time, and visually it stands out. It's sort of a mix between luxury fashion and streetwear. Kind of difficult to describe it. You should follow them on Instagram. The reason I wanted to bring it up here is Jerry Lorenzo also is in charge of Adidas basketball now. And so Fear
Wow.
of God Athletics has a partnership with Adidas, and that existed prior to the whole Kanye fallout with Adidas. And so, anyway, Jerry Lorenzo was on a YouTube interview with Complex. You guys know Complex, I'm
Yeah.
sure. I'm halfway through the interview, and I just really like Fear of God. I think Jerry Lorenzo brings a really interesting perspective into athletic footwear and apparel based on his experience with streetwear and fashion. And Adidas is benefiting mightily from his association. So I'm halfway through that interview, and so far I would definitely recommend it. Those are my BPCs this week.
Super cool. Thanks, Dan.
Okay, Peter Abraham, thank you so much for joining Second Nature for the first time. I'm sure it'll be the first of many. Now that you know Aaron Lutzy, I'm sure you guys will have an abundant, or a very active text chain between the two of you as you go down to Bentonville and experience the entire bike industry down there.
Great. Thanks for having me, guys.